Welcome, everyone. This is Dr.Celani speaking. I want to invite you to a talk that I'm giving for the Object Relations Institute on September 20th, starting at 11:30. It's a 4-hour workshop, and I will be featuring, as always, the work of W.R.D. Fairbairn, a Scottish psychoanalyst who is not well known, and I will be taking his model and applying it to 4 very significant disorders. First is the borderline, second is the hysteric, third is the narcissist, and fourth is the obsessional disorder. Now, Fairbairn's model is not well known because he made 2 tremendous errors. And the first is that his papers came out in 1940 to 1958. And in his papers, which are collected in a book called The Psychoanalytic Studies of the Personality, still available, he challenged Freud. And worse than that, he argued with him in his writing, and he said in his 58 paper, I have replaced all of Freud's metapsychology with my own. Well, you couldn't have made a bigger error. You just couldn't have. Because in those days, i.e. starting in 40 and in 58, the whole world of psychoanalysis was just psychoanalysts that were, already certified as psychoanalysts. There wasn't this big, broad spectrum that we have today of psychotherapists and this and that, all these subgroups that have become interested in psychoanalysis. In those days, it was only trained psychoanalysts who read this type of material. That was his constituency. And he offended almost 100% of them. So his model was not going to get a lot of airplay. It just wasn't. He underestimated the loyalty of the analytic community to Freud and Freud's metapsychology. He absolutely underestimated. He thought, oh, they'll like mine because it's better. Well, they didn't like his. And worse, he was treated as a pariah. People would walk away from at psychoanalytic meetings. People would walk away from him, wouldn't talk to him. He was considered to be a traitor. This is no way to spread your model because this was his only constituency. All right. His model was put in the psychoanalytic dustbin and basically forgotten for many years. Second error that he made was that his presentation of the model was confused. It doubled back on itself. It had contradictions within itself. It used classical metaphors when, in fact, this was an alternative model to classical theory. He had a mishmash of a model. Since he died at 64, he was born in 1889, a bunch of us have reformulated his model and cleaned up all the multiple errors in it. And these people are Stephen Mitchell, myself, Jeff Seinfeld, Thomas Ogden, and David and Jill Savage Sharp. All of us were interested in this. There's numbers of books on Fairbairn. And so what do we mean by cleaning up? We took the errors that he made were pretty big. And just by eliminating those errors, you end up with the fundamentals of his model. And if you use those fundamentals, you will end up with it's a powerhouse of the model. I mean, any model that it can explain the borderline, hysteric, narcissist, and obsessive, just like that, has some merit. Okay, so what was his model? Well, his model is in the relational group. That is, if you, Greenberg and Mitchell, in their 83 book, broke down all models into either drive theory or relational. And in terms of structuralization of the ego, it was either the id, the ego, and the superego as they matured, or it was the internalization of objects that created structures in the psyche. So it's a relational model. Secondly, it's a dissociation and trauma model. It's a great one, and it's the first one. Unless you consider 1895 Freud's study on hysteria, where he had a very simple trauma model. Well, he abandoned it, of course, when he discovered psychoanalysis. That's now called pre-psychoanalysis, but he abandoned that. And this model I will use to explain these four powerful disorders that need an explanation. You need to know what's going on. So it's a trauma and dissociation model. And the third thing, so it's a relational model, it's trauma and dissociation, and finally, it's a developmental arrest model. And we'll see how the trauma inhibits development. So it's a developmental arrest model. Now, you might say, if he challenged Freud and said, this is a completely different way of looking at things, why is it psychoanalysis? Why isn't it something else? It's psychoanalysis because of the primacy of the unconscious. This model believes, as all psychoanalytic models must believe, or they wouldn't be classified as psychoanalytic, that the unconscious is the fundamental motivator of human behavior. And it certainly does. And the second thing is that it focuses on transference, which it does. And finally, it also spends a great deal of time talking about resistance to treatment. Why do patients resist? Why don't you just give them a little talk and they do what you say? I was in practice for 36 years. That's kind of a joke, you know. They not only won't they listen, they'll do the opposite. So that's where it sits in psychoanalysis. It's developmental, it's trauma dissociation, and it's based on relational events that are internalized. In effect, if you want to compare it to Freud's, it's equivalent sort of to Freud's superego, where the child internalizes the parent's values. In Fairbairn's model, it's complete internalization of the relationships that exist in the internal world. The child, his unconscious is blank at birth, blank. It's no id. There isn't a boiling id with all these drives from the Neanderthal man and all Darwin and all that. Okay. So the fundamental need of a child is a safe and loving relationship with the parents, which in most families occurs. The child needs warmth, comfort, safety, and attention to its needs on a sort of continuous basis. The infant, as Fairbairn said, is completely psychologically, physically, emotionally, completely dependent on his objects, mostly his mother or her mother, gender neutral, his or her. So the infant is very sensitive to parental failures because of this, because their attachment is based on the fact that the parent delivers the emotional goods time after time. When things go awry and there's parental indifference or parental cruelty or parental ignoring or lack of safety, the child is traumatized. That infant, and I say infant, I mean young, all the way up to 10, 12, that child cannot afford to remember that these events occurred, because it would break its attachment, its sense of safety, its sense of comfort, its sense of relief that it has someone that understands it. It's too much for the child to bear. And so what that child does is dissociate. Boom. Now, don't forget, dissociation was seen as an extreme defense. And that only happened like when you're in an auto accident or something. You see an arm and it turns out to be yours. And you say, oh, that's an interesting arm. Oh, well, it's yours. Well, these are traumatic events of the same magnitude because the infant is so absolutely dependent on his mother or her mother. So these events are forced into the unconscious. Now, if they happen on occasion or rarely, then there's not much material, not much memories. This model all deals in memories of events that are internalized. If not much has happened to the child in a negative way, and much positive things have happened, then the memories build up in the central ego, the conscious ego, and they're available and they're supportive. And the child goes out in life, has courage, comes back to parents for support when needed, then goes out, can differentiate, and then finally integrate. These are the two fundamental aspects of development: differentiation from the object and integration of good and bad memories of the object. That's what development is all. Those are two fundamentals of development. So things go well, the child differentiates, learns that he's separate from the parents, the terrible twos where he runs away, comes back, and the parent is always welcoming, it's always safe, and then the child develops and sooner or later can go out, can go to friends' houses, can stay overnight when a teenager, can go to be in a play in school and not cry and fall apart, has that type of, can interact with friends easily, is eager to go out. All right. And it really so these memories pile up and form ego structures. And so the first one, which is a good one, is the memories of the loving parent in relationship to the child, and that's called the central ego, relates to the child's central ego, relates to the parent, who's called an ideal or idealized object. And those were, if they're abundant, they give the child strength, and they give the child courage, goes out and differentiates. If things go awry, if the parent is indifferent, if the parent is cruel, if the parent is missing, a drug addicted or alcoholic parent, if the parent is episodic, comes and goes and comes and goes, all these things go right into the child's unconscious and they build up. The first sub-ego or sub-self that occurs and develops is the package. It's a package of memories of the child in relationship to its parent. And that is a parent who is rejected, indifferent, avoidant, hostile, mocking, all these possibilities. And that sub-self, and I'd say sub because it's in the unconscious, because all these events have been dissociated and shoved into, they form a memory bank, a memory package of the child's self in relationship to the parent. And this sub-ego, which is mostly unconscious, because the child is protecting himself against realizing that he's not loved, not safe, has no parents, and is alone in the world. That's what that abandonment, that existential terror of abandonment is held off by packaging all these events that indicate that, but they're dissociated and packaged up and in what Fairbairn called the antilibidinal ego. That's the child self. That's the child self that's angry, ashamed, self-conscious, feels terrible, feels bad. And Fairbairn used some unbelievable words. This is 1944 paper. He said his sense of self is reduced to worthless beggardom. That's the word, beggardom. He's a beggar, and he feels inferior with all this negative information. The antilibidinal ego is in a relationship in his unconscious to the memory of the parent. I mean, this Fairbairn always has a self and an object. His structural theory, this is the beginning of the structural theory. There's always a self in relationship to an object. Okay, so here we have the child self in relationship to a rejecting object, and these structures talk to each other, thanks to the work of Thomas Ogden, a California psychoanalyst who described the dialogues that go on. And the dialogues are sort of simplistic versions of events that have happened a million times. I told you you were wrong. You are. Why don't you do what I say? You're you should be ashamed of yourself. You are tarnishing the Celani name. Whatever the parent said to the child 1,000 times, those are remembered. And this is the continuous interaction in the child's unconscious. They don't go away. These memories don't go away. Now, if a child just had an antilibidinal ego and a rejecting object, there would be no hope. There would be no hope in life. And they would get morbidly depressed at 4 or 5 years old. However, the child saves himself or herself by a second, mostly unconscious ego structure called the libidinal ego. And this is a sense of self that only sees the best of the parent and only sees what the child hopes that the parent becomes. Okay? Now, and of course, you can see this in literature. We have unbelievable examples of it. But anyway, the libidinal ego is a balancing structure that keeps the child from falling into despair and from losing the attachment of the needed object. The child can stay attached to a brutal and rejecting object because the libidinal ego keeps telling him or her, mommy loves you. There'll be love around the corner. If you only tidy your room, be kinder, don't talk back, wash your hands. If you do all these things, mommy will love you, or dad will love you. So this is the libidinal ego that the child draws upon to keep them attached. All right. So these are the structures: the central ego relating to the ideal object in good families, the antilibidinal ego remembering all the times that the child has been rejected, hurt, and humiliated, relating to a rejecting object, and then finally the libidinal ego relating to a fantasy that there's love in this horrible parent. That's the structural theory. Now, everybody sort of chokes up about this because it's not id, ego, superego. It's not simple because each structure is a pair. The next interesting thing is that these structures can become conscious and sweep away the central ego. And this is when you say, well, he's just not himself today. Well, yes, he is. He's a separate, dissociated self that has emerged and come up and roared and sees the world as a hateful place. It's the antilibidinal ego thrashing and screaming and seeing the world as a rejecting object, or worse, becoming a rejecting object and treating others as if they were antilibidinal egos. So these structures can come up and down. Fairbairn mistakenly thought they were held in the unconscious due to aggression from the central ego. No such thing. It's anxiety. These are triggered by anxiety. And as a young therapist, I knew nothing of Fairbairn. I had a 6-year program in graduate school with, different internships at state hospital. I never heard of this stuff. And so I go out into practice, and I have 6 patients initially, and they're all shifting ego states in my office. And I haven't not the faintest idea what the hell is going on. I start pressuring the patient about how bad their parents are. And in the middle, they said, shut up, Dr. Celani. If you say one more bad thing about my mother, I am leaving this room and I am calling the medical board and reporting you. I would sit there like, what? What? It happened so many times that I started to put a name on it. This is a real phenomenon that happened in my office in Burlington, Vermont, constantly. And I called it, oh, we're back to hope springs eternal. Okay. So I saw this shift in ego states. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know why. But I could see that if I pressured a patient about how bad those parents were, I now understand that it put them into an abandonment crisis because they started to see, along with me, that they had horrible parents that abused and neglected them. And even if they were 35 years old, that meant they were going to lose the entire fantasy of a good family. And that's when they would shift to the libidinal ego and tell me they were going to call the state police, which happened. They called that one police said she was going to slap me in the face. Oh, I backed right off. So I saw this. You probably have seen this all the time. Fairbairn's model explains this very, very clearly, very, very clearly. Now, I want to give you an example. Let's use hysteria. That's a nice disorder. I wrote a paper in 2005, Contemporary Psychoanalysis, which will be in the literature Dropbox. Hysteria is easily understood. It's probably the easiest to be understood by this model. It happened to me a number of times in the social world where 9 out of 10 hysterics are female. You can have a male hysteric who's either a gay man or an effeminate man. The number one complaint, when I say 9 out of 10, there's a paper by Lusada et al. Way back when they looked at admissions to emergency rooms with crises. They counted how many people were male and female that presented with this form of disorder. Typically, 9 out of 10 times, we have that what they call we used to be called the castration scene when I was young. The castration interpersonal scene is when a man, often slightly older and more successful, is approached by a woman who has flashing eyes, has a lot of, it's called personal decoration, jewelry, it's made up, and comes up to the male and says, "Oh, Dr. Smith, you are so appealing. I hear that," and the male target, let's say he's uninformed and naive and maybe exploitive of women, says, "Oh, yes, well, yes, I am," and allows himself to be pumped up by this woman in terms of his status, importance, and power. And so the male then says to the female, "Well, would you like to come back to my apartment and see my etchings?" He becomes enraged. "You are just like everybody else." Bam! And slaps him across the face and storms out. What is this? This is splitting. This is splitting. Simple. The woman sees the man as an exciting object. The libidinal ego, by the way, sees the parent as an exciting object. I forgot to mention the object end of that scenario. He's an exciting object. He promises nurturance, love, and support, not sex. However, she lures him with her sexuality, and she absolutely refuses to understand that's what she's doing. Okay, so she charms him, and he takes the cue that it is sexuality, not parenting, that she needs. Offers, "Come up and see my etchings," and she detects that it's sexual, and she slams him in the face. What is the history? What is the typical history of a hysteric? Typical history, and I had many when I started out, is family constellation, where the mother, because she was married to a narcissistic, a blowhard husband, was exhausted and disgusted with her husband and avoided of her husband. And the father turns to his daughter as a substitute woman and takes his daughter shopping, going to buy dresses. I had a patient whose father built in the basement a crude stage out of 2x4s and plywood, put some lights there, had a curtain, and would bring a record player down, and his daughter would dress up in a little tutu and dance to different songs that he would play on the record. Mom would be upstairs steaming and enraged, thinking that her daughter was taking her husband away. This is an older disorder. I don't know if it's as common as it used to be. It was common when I started my practice in 74. It was common back then. I can't tell you. I don't know where it sits today. But anyway, that's the dynamic. So the young woman, in some ways, sees the father. The mother is a blank because she's indifferent to the child and pays no attention to her. So all her focus is on her father. She sees the father as an exciting object. He promises love. At the same time, as she gets older, she realizes that she's basically dancing for her dinner, that she is being forced to be cute and beautiful and charming. So her father gets some sort of pleasure out of this whole deal, and that angers her, including the fact that when she gets older, very often the father will turn on her and say ugly things when she starts to go out and date boys. In one case, my patient said her father said, "You're just a whore," when she went out in high school on her first date. So this ambivalence, by the way, Fairbairn model prevents integration. I said differentiation and integration. So there's always this split two versions of the parent. There's the idealized version of the father, and then there's the rejecting version of the father. Okay. And so that's what this splitting model shows. She comes up, she's all alluring, she sees the man as an exciting object. He takes the bait, says, "Let's go to see my etching." And then she suddenly splits from one ego state to another. I saw this in my yeah, the first years of my practice. I feel so sorry for myself because I didn't know what I was doing. And she sees him as a rejecting. She shifts from, he becomes from an exciting object to a rejecting object. And she gets to discharge her rage at all that her father did to her. So that's an example of application of this model to a disorder. The others are, we use the same structures, the three pairs, the central ego, ideal object, the antilibidinal ego relating to the rejecting object, and the libidinal ego relating to the exciting part of the parent. Those are, and it's each structure has two. There's self and an object, self and an object. That's why it's really different. This is a two-person relational psychoanalysis. And again, it is psychoanalysis. All this is happening in the unconscious. These structures come up and down. That's the thing that Fairbairn was he said it was possible, but he didn't illustrate it. And another failure of Fairbairn's model, gave no instructions how to use it and very few examples. So his model is more theory than practice. And that's what Ogden, myself, Mitchell, and Scharf, and Seinfeld have done. We've made it usable in practice. And so that's what this talk will be about. First of all, how the structures evolve, what they are. And secondly, taking a look at these very, very well-known disorders and applying the structural theory to demonstrate how they can be understood and actually how you can reduce, if not eliminate, the problems by introducing to the central ego the material that is split off in these substructures. Now, that's the talk. I urge you to come to it. It'll be fun. I'm a noisy speaker. I have a lot of fun doing it. And this will be on September 20th, Saturday the 20th, starting at 11:30. And you can tap into it at the Object Relations Institute website, which is located in New York, and also on the web. I look forward to seeing you all. Thank you very much.